Wake up call.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Together, we now have both an opportunity and a responsibility to not only pass this bill in its current form, but to strengthen it. Mr. Chair, I look forward to supporting amendments that will address the assault-style rifle ban as the Mass Casualty Commission final report called on us to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, and staff for being with us today on this important matter. Minister, it's been a while that we've been waiting for you to come to this committee for these consultations, 6 weeks since we wrapped up our consultation. I know when you first introduced this bill almost a year ago, you took the position that you wanted this passed as quickly as possible. And then when it came to committee in the late fall, Liberal members on this committee were insistent that we pass this bill within a week. Now, this is months later, and you've made us wait 6 weeks for you to come here. So I do appreciate that you're here now to answer our questions. You did mention in the opening remarks that a cornerstone of your legislation, Bill C21, is to combat gun traffickers, which is something that I deeply support. I think law enforcement also support that. As you know, Toronto police have said almost 9 out of 10 guns used in crimes in Toronto are smuggled from the United States. So collectively, police have told us and to you that this is a primary focus, should be, for fighting gun violence in this country. So I appreciate that C21, based on your remarks, is attempting to do that. I know you've talked about it on national television. You talked about it today, that this bill will strengthen, as your words, penalties for gun traffickers from their 10-year maximum sentence now to 14 years. How common is it now to award or to sentence someone to 10 years, the current maximum? How common is that now?
Ms. Dancho, thank you for your question. Thank you as well for outlining the work that I have been engaged with over the last 6 weeks, but not only then, indeed right back to the start when we tabled this bill. And I have heard loudly and clearly from Canadians from every walk of life, including from gun owners and First Nations communities and Canadians, about what they expect out of this bill, which are smart gun laws.
Right.
You've asked me about maximum sentences.
Right.
I've worked on the front lines of the criminal justice system as a federal prosecutor. I will tell you that I have confidence in the judiciary to exercise good judgment when it comes to making sure that we separate those gun traffickers from our communities when we need to do so.
How common is it that the current maximum of 10 years, how common is that right now since you formed government in 2015?
Ms. Dancho.
Is it common at all? Does it happen quite a bit?
Ms. Dancho, every single case is taken on its facts, but I have confidence in the judiciary to use the higher maximum sentences to make sure that gun traffickers who terrorize our communities with guns are separated from the community so we can keep our communities safe.
I would hope that would be the case, certainly, given how many lives are being taken, given how important it is that we tackle gun smuggling. I would agree with that statement you made. However, the information that your office provided to my office is that not one person, since the Liberals formed government in 2015, not one person has been awarded the current 10-year maximum sentence. So it is frustrating to see you talk on national television here today in question period to our questions about how you're getting tough on gun traffickers and increasing the maximum to 14 when the current 10 has never been used since your Prime Minister formed government a few years ago. So I just feel that that's really a non-starter and it's really not going to do a lot to combat this issue, unfortunately. So that part of C21 isn't going to make that much of an impact given the maximum of 10 years has never been used since the Liberals formed government a few years ago. But I do want to move on to the red flag provisions. This is an area, to be honest, that I was looking forward to. As you'll recall, I asked that this be split from the bill so we can take the politics out of it and look to support the red flag provisions. You were in the chamber at that time. You did not allow me to split that out of there. But what we found in our testimony is that the Canadian Bar Association, the National Associations of Women in the Law, which was a Liberal witness, domestic violence groups from Quebec, and also 3 chiefs and vice chiefs that we invited to committee all did not want those red flag laws provided or passed in this bill. They did not support them. And they're the very groups that I would have imagined would have supported them because they were supposed to be for vulnerable groups and women of domestic violence situations. That's why I was interested in supporting them off the bat, but yet we heard firsthand that they're no good. In fact, the quotes were quite damning. The women's group said that it would prohibit extremely quick action that is essential to preventing femicide. It is likely to be risky and impractical for women whose safety is at risk. It also says it will do more harm than good for women impacted by this. And the Indigenous groups mentioned that racism could play a factor, that the red flag laws could be abused. If someone just doesn't like someone in a First Nation, they can have their guns apprehended. That is the impression that your red flag laws in this bill has given the public. So those don't seem to be any good either. And it's just frustrating because there's not a lot in this bill that we can really talk about because you've already passed the handgun ban through regulation in the fall. So that major keystone, as you've called it, in C21, has already been accomplished by your government. So looking at the bill, 1 minute, thank you, there's not a lot in there. And yet this has been holding up the good work of this committee for quite some time. And as you know, there's about 4 or 5 inches worth of amendments and clause by clause on C21 that we still have to do. And there's only 2 months left, Minister. And you made us wait 6 weeks. You also have 2 other bills in the chamber waiting to come to this committee, not to mention that there's been a 32% increase of violent crime, as you're well aware, since your government took office 7 years ago. And of that crime, less than half of 1 percentage point is committed by long guns, and yet your government has chosen to divide Canadians with the amendments that you've recently pulled. So it's really not clear to me what C21 is going to accomplish, and reasonably, I think we can understand if you would pull this bill, and I'm just wondering, to conclude, if that's part of your plan, Minister.
Mr. Angelo, your time is up, but we'll allow the Minister...
Yeah, I'd ask for some discretion from the Chair because Ms. Dancho did speak for approximately 3 minutes, and there are some very important points there. I'm happy to stretch out my visit to this committee to accommodate other members who may wish to also use their time. But first, Ms. Dancho, I fundamentally disagree. There is a lot of good policy in this bill, including the national handgun freeze, which you and your party opposed.
You've already accomplished that through regulation.
Mr. Angelo, the Minister has the floor.
How much time are you going to let him speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may be permitted to answer the numerous substantive points, because I think, in fairness, Canadians, Ms. Dancho's raised some good questions. Canadians have a right to hear the answer from the government. I disagree. There's good policy in here, including the national handgun freeze, including the red flag and yellow flag laws. On balance, Mr. Chair, we've heard the concerns of a number of advocate groups. We have made some modifications to the red flag provisions so that we can ensure that there is protection of those who come forward to avail themselves of another layer of protection. And the last thing I just want to say with regards to sentencing provision is I share the concern that Ms. Dancho articulates around maximum sentences. By raising maximum sentences, we're sending a very strong signal to the courts that for those who do terrorize our communities with guns, that there should be higher sentences. And that is a far better approach than the failed Conservative policies around sentencing and mandatory minimum penalties and the overreach of the Conservative Party on MMPs, which have been systematically struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada.
Thank you, Minister. On y va maintenant, Monsieur Shifke.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today with us. I liked in your opening remarks, you said we're going to have some constructive dialogue today, so let's have some right now, Minister, and lay it all on the table. And we're not going to talk about technical gun sides of this today. We're going to try and figure out where we are today, how we got here, and where we're going tomorrow. So, Minister, you stood up in the House multiple times and stated that opposition parties who were concerned with your pre-planned amendments to Bill C21 were spreading misinformation. However, on February 3rd, when you withdrew your amendments, your own government House leader stated, and I will quote, "There were gaps and problems in the amendments. That's why we've retracted them." End of quote. Could you now please admit that the genuine concerns that Canadians had about these amendments were not baseless misinformation?
Mr. Shipley, I have zero regrets about advancing smart, effective gun policy. And I've heard loud and clearly from Canadians that it's important that we continue on putting in place the types of policies that will protect communities from assault-style firearms. And this is not abstract, and you know this, Mr. Shipley, because you and I have spoken about this. But those assault-style firearms have visited upon communities in Nova Scotia and Quebec and elsewhere the most indescribably difficult consequences and losses and tragedies. And that is why the Mass Casualty Commission has called on the government to strengthen our gun laws when it comes to assault-style firearms. And that is why I'm prepared to work with you and every other party and every other parliamentarian so that we can protect Canadians. That is the opportunity and the responsibility that we have now. And Mr. Shipley, I hope that we can do that work together.
We certainly can. But, Minister, again, we said we were going to have constructive dialogue. I didn't once bring up a model or a type of firearm. I'm not talking about that today. I'm trying to figure out how we got here and how much we were told about this misinformation. And I think we can all agree maybe there wasn't quite as much misinformation as people were being led to believe. There was some facts in people's concerns. Sir, we heard from many different groups that there was not enough consultation done before these amendments were brought out. I found it very interesting that once the amendments came out and there was a bit of an uproar, not a bit, a large uproar over them, that the amendments were introduced in November 2022. In January 2023, you took it upon yourself, and I saw your social media, you took a large tour across Canada. You called that a consultation tour. I find it interesting that the tour was taken after the amendments were taken out. I'd just like to know, was this really a consultation tour, or was this a sales and promotion tour?
Mr. Shipley, if you want this to be constructive, let's not be cynical. I was doing consultations before and after the amendments, and the fact of the matter is this. At the end of the day, the two visions that we have before us right now is about putting in place gun laws that will see fewer and ideally no assault-style firearms which were designed for a battlefield in our communities versus the policies that have been advanced by you and the Conservative Party of Canada, which would make them legal again. We think that's wrong. We think that's wrong.
Absolute BS.
Can we, point of order, can we let the minister speak?
He speaks the truth, sure.
Mr. Motz, you're out of order.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Minister.
I have nothing to add to that answer.
Thank you.
Time remaining.
Thank you. Hope I have just a little bit more time. Thank you, Minister. I have one more question for you, sir. You mentioned about the consultations you were doing, and I'll take you at your word for that. In February, though, multiple sources spoke to the Toronto Star about your approach to Bill C21, relaying that, and I will quote, "As the amendments landed, Mendocino was testifying before the Public Order Inquiry Commission, and the usual normal briefings and communications plans that would have been attached to such a legislative move fell by the wayside." End of quote. Minister, you are the minister. You're the top guy of the safety here.
Were you going to say social media? Because that's
No, that's not. I'm the last one to mention social media. Do you take responsibility for the disaster Bill C21 has been?
Mr. Shipley, we have an opportunity now to take a good bill and make it even stronger. And I take umbrage to some of the comments that were not made on the record by your colleague, Mr. Motz. It is very clear. The Conservatives have said repeatedly that they would repeal legislation that this government has put into place, including Bill C21, including Bill C21, when hopefully it passes and becomes law. And the consequence of that is that we will have weaker, not stronger legislation when it comes to keeping assault-style firearms out of our streets, out of our communities. Mr. Chair, that is why the Mass Casualty Commission has called on this government to make sure that we take those next concrete steps to keep those guns which were designed for a battlefield out of our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. Go ahead,
you,
please.
Mr. Chair.
5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming. We all witnessed the Mass Casualty Commission report come out, and the report seemed to echo a lot of the policies that your government has been promoting. But I would ask, Minister, in the case of the Portapique killer, how would a gun ban have prevented somebody who smuggled firearms and didn't have a license from possessing these firearms?
Well, I'm glad you raised the question. I think it allows me to explain the rationale of our policy. But before I do that, and if you'll permit, Mr. Lloyd, I would hope that we all join in expressing our condolences and support to the families of Portapique and Truro, some of whom I have met with, including people like Nick Beaton, who lost his wife, who was pregnant at the time.
Minister, we all grieve for the families, but Minister, I had a direct question for you. How would a gun ban have prevented the Portapique killer from accessing illegally smuggled firearms without a license? How would it have prevented him from having those firearms?
The short answer is that by putting in place a ban, we reduce the possibility and the likelihood of there being any of these types of firearms in our communities. And that's the difference, is that the Conservatives believe that by not having a ban, that somehow that translates into safer communities. The Conservatives, respectfully, are fundamentally wrong on that point.
Policies that actually take crime down and take criminals down, not policies that are virtue signaling. Minister, given that the killer was in possession of illegal firearms without a license, I mean, how could a ban, if they're not being enforced, if the police who knew that the Portapique killer had access to illegal firearms weren't acting, how would a ban do anything to prevent criminals from accessing to firearms? There's currently bans from criminals possessing firearms in this country without a license as it is, and yet they continue to access firearms. Bans don't seem to be working, Minister. How do you think this new so-called ban on so-called assault-style firearms is going to be any different?
Mr. Lloyd. And if I may, Mr. Chair, I think it's quite revealing. The 2 points that I would say in response is, one, Mr. Lloyd, you refer to other practical steps. We put $450 million into the CBSA, into border security. Your party voted against those provisions. I've seen that technology at work. You're hearing about the progress of seizing illegal guns. But the other thing, Mr. Chair, is calling a national ban on assault-style firearms virtue signaling completely misses the mark and is disrespectful to every Canadian who has lost a loved one as a result of those firearms.
Mr. Chair. What is disrespectful to Canadians is putting forward divisive political policies that are only designed to help the Liberal Party win elections, instead of policies that will actually combat violent crime in our communities. That is what is disrespectful to victims. Canadians, especially gun-owning Canadians, are committed to supporting any legislation that will have a positive impact on reducing violence and gun crime in our streets. Legal gun owners in this country have a vested interest in ensuring that our streets are safe, because every time a gun crime is committed by a criminal in this country, it draws into suspicion the millions of legal firearms owners who have hunted peaceably, who have used their firearms peaceably from generation to generation. And yet every time a criminal commits a vile act, these millions of hunters, these millions of gun owners are demonized by your government. You've spoken of these nebulous special interest groups and their desire to have no laws whatsoever in this country. That is the kind of political rhetoric that gets in the way of us being able to have a responsible debate. There is no one serious in this country who is saying that we should have no firearms laws. There is no one serious in this country who is saying that we need to have a Second Amendment style American laws in this country. That is not the political consensus that Canadians expect, and yet we are led to believe by your government that these are real debates that are happening. These are not real debates that are happening. What the real debates that need to happen, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, the truth of the matter is that it's not just this government who supports a national assault-style firearm ban and taking additional step. It's the Mass Casualty Commission. It's law enforcement, as you heard earlier from Mr. Shifke. It's Canadians who've lost loved ones, and indeed, it is the vast majority of Canadians. And that is what I have heard consistently. It's also from responsible gun owners with whom I have engaged with.
Well, that's not what we heard from groups like the Edmonton Police Association, not what we heard from the National Police Federation, who are saying that these so-called assault-style firearm bans are only going to divert resources away from the real action that is needed to get criminals off of our streets. And that is the action that we as Conservatives are committed to implementing, so that we can ensure that these repeat violent offenders that seem to be getting out of jail in record numbers under your leadership, Minister, under your leadership, these criminals are getting back out on the street faster than ever in order to commit violent crimes over and over and over again. We need to stop the re-victimization of Canadians by liberal revolving door justice policies.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd.